Today, we are here to talk about a debate that has been ongoing from the dawn of time, or at least ever since combat robotics has been around. Are bots with active weapons destined to remain supreme? Do control bots have an important and valid place in this sport? Has the meta shifted? We talk about all of this and so much more on this episode of Outside of the Box.
I'm ready to smash and burn.
No corner. I am going to be uncomfortable and all over you from start to finish.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Outside of the Box. And today we're talking about a tale as old as time, which is active weapons versus control bots, specifically, in all of the different discussions surrounding that. So I have what I think is an excellent panel to talk about this topic today, as we have people from every end of the spectrum and, some that kind of flow on both sides of the coin there. So just welcome to the show, everyone.
Hello.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So the first thing I'm going to do, as I have on all of these panels, is have everybody introduce themselves. Everyone that is here has been on my show at some point. So fans of the show that watch it all the time will definitely know who everyone is. But just for the sake of doing it, if this is your first time watching, I want to make sure that everybody gets to tell who they are and what their robots are and all of that good stuff. So I will kick it off with Zack.
My name is Zack Knight. I am the builder of several robots at NHRL currently, Pramheda, Pramheda, and Crunk. And I have been building vert robots since about 2011.
Yes, and they are some pretty killer verts at that. Brandon.
Yeah, so my name is Bennett Young. I'm also a builder at NHRL. Primarily do a lot of the 30-pound robots. My two robots actually above me, Phenomenon, Fracus, and two other machines, Demogorgon and Vorion. I've also been on BattleBots, the team Mammoth, so pretty good range there. I've been fighting robots since about 2010. Beat you, Zack.
By 1 year.
I've been around it since 08, so.
There it is.
Matt.
I'm Matthew Lantry, compete primarily at NHRL as well as some New Jersey events in the Garden State Combat Robotics League. My two robots I compete with are Fallout and Half-Life, both of which are control lifter bots.
Yes, so we know what side of things Matt falls on. Johnny.
I'm Johnny. I also compete at NHRL pretty often with my horizontal spinner Spartan. It's a 3-pounder that started as a vector kit years ago, and ever since then I've been, just advancing from there, and it's no longer a vector. And yeah, I love the chaos that horizontal spinners cause. And I also like how I can kind of just aim at people. I don't have to be like a good driver, like you control bot people. I can just smack things.
Sure, there's advantages to having a big weapon. And I'll throw out there, After Image also has a very big weapon. Last but certainly not least, not that he needs any introduction really, but James.
I'm James. I'm one half of the Cooper brothers that build Quantum and head of the technical team for Robot Wars.
Yes, one of the most beautiful death machines ever created.
Thank you. That's so kind.
True. It is definitely an art piece. It's the kind of thing that, if it ever hit eBay and I saw it, maybe I'd pick it up and make a coffee table out of it.
You may have your chance.
Ooh, okay.
So yeah, we're here to talk about, there's always so much discussion. Of course, when it comes to fans, there's fans that love the destruction and love, just a big weapon tearing other robots to pieces. And then there's other fans who appreciate the skill that it takes to drive a control bot and, get people in the right places to make sure that you cause them to do damage to themselves in some cases. And of course, there's those like me who fall completely in between, and often have trouble making a decision which I like better. So we'll kind of talk about an array of things. I think it's pretty clear that Zack and Johnny tend to fall on the side of the active weapons, whereas Matt and James fall on the control bot side. And Brandon, you've done a little bit of both.
Yeah, we had a pretty good experience there.
Yes, so I think that we have a good mix to really have a discussion about this. So I mean, the first topic that I really want to bring up, because it's still fairly fresh, is that this past season of BattleBots, I think, was so different than a lot of others, where you saw control bots have a lot of success where maybe they didn't have quite that level of success in the past. Quantum definitely not being an exception to that. I mean, 4-0 in the qualifiers was outstanding. So I'm just curious to hear everybody's thoughts. Is there a true shift in the meta? Like, is this something we are going to continue to see? Or do you think that it was just a one-off and the active weapons are going to kind of come rearing back in the next season? So I'll shoot it off first. We'll just go around. Zack, to share your thoughts on that.
Can I ask one quick question?
Oh, yeah, sure.
I've never heard of the term control bot before other people started saying Quantum was a control bot. And I've never thought of it being a control bot. So it'd be great to get your thoughts on what the heck is a control bot? What's its purpose?
Sure. I mean,
spinners are really good for delivering kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is a really good way of destroying your opponent. It's probably the best way, to be fair. And whether you do that by getting a lot of kinetic energy into a flywheel, or whether you can use gravity to put kinetic energy into your opponent and then smack them against the floor. So that's a really good way of doing it. Or you can use brute force or wrestling and things. So, but it'd be good to hear thoughts on what is a control bot, how do we define it, and what are we talking about when we say a robot that's a control bot over something that's not one?
That's a very valid point, because I think that
because I haven't got a clue.
Yeah, when you look at control bots, I mean, it's very similar to how people define what is an unconventional robot. That not everybody looks at that the same. There's some robots that people may just throwing Ripperoni as an example. I consider it unconventional because it has a different kind of weapon mechanism that's, different than what you see. But then some people will say, well, they have, an active weapon, so it's not really what you would think of as unconventional. And I think the same could probably be said with control bots. Obviously a robot like Quantum has an active weapon in the jaws. I think for me, when I consider a robot a control bot, I look at basically not having a spinner weapon is typically what I think of as a control bot. But I'm curious then to get everybody else's thoughts on that.
I think a control bot is, as you kind of said, something that isn't a high kinetic, high velocity weapon. Like it essentially requires more finesse, per se, to a degree. Like Quantum, I know you guys have talked about, you can't just kind of throw your teeth wherever from time to time, and same things with like Crash Fest, as an example, with Robert Rund. I know he drives in a very particular manner because he has to control the fight in a different way, meaning you're either winning it via, grabbing people and keeping them in corners and pinning, or breaking themselves against walls, where a control, like an active weapon robot like Pramheda or Spartan, is more trying to KO people or damage them in a way where it shows on a scorecard that they have taken significant damage.
I think that at the end of the day, a control bot exactly requires more finesse. Like for an active weapon like Pramheda, I don't have to do anything but other than line up a shot. I don't have to be particular about where I'm going, whatnot. I can make contact. Whereas in situations like with Quantum, you have to line up, get a proper spot, and kind of pick that point, otherwise back off, retry again. But I feel like the dominance in being able to use the arena to your advantage is where I guess a control bot is where my definition of that stands.
I would say, going on to the anything that's not a spinner point, I would not consider Shatter a control bot. When I think of a control bot, I think of a robot that literally controls another bot. So Quantum, I would say, is like a grappler control bot. Because it gets that bite and then you guys just ram them. You have control,
Plan.
you have complete control.
And
So
I
is it
remember
that you have control, or is it that you win fights by controlling the other robot? So when I say that, I'm talking about Quantum was never designed to control a fight in that respect. And then you've got that with Swordblaze as well, is in that sometimes I hear that being called a control bot, and I totally get that, in that it's designed to corral and it's designed to fight in a different way than a traditional spinner would. But I'll say, when people call Quantum a control bot, I always get a little confused because it's never its intention to win a fight by controlling. It was designed to cause internal damage to robots. And if you can control the fight, then great, but we don't really care about winning by just controlling it, if that makes sense. So one thing was, people were asking us if we were concerned about the holding time being reduced for this year's BattleBots, and it never really was anything that that passed our mind, because even at this year's BattleBots, we never hold to the limit, because we always feel like we're just pulling the clock down. If you do that, it's quite a defense. For us in particular, it's quite a defensive thing. And if you grab hold of them and bite them and just kind of not really do a lot with them at that point, you're reducing the possibility of actually causing a KO and actually gaining that win. You're just kind of almost putting the battle into a hold mode until you let go, and then the battle restarts. Whereas we actually want to finish the fight. We want to try and win by causing damage, and we just do it in a different way to a high kinetic energy weapon. We just do it through brute force. So that's why I would say, for us being a control bot, the purpose is never really to get control for that sake, if that makes sense. And I totally get you with Shatter, in that I personally wouldn't call that control bot. I don't see as that Adam really ever. Yeah, you want to control the fight, but you're not trying to gain control over your opponent. You're trying to beat the living daylights out of them. I don't know. That's maybe where my British thing is gone off on a different path.
Oh no, you're fine. And actually, I was just going to throw in there that I think that the intention, as far as like what you're trying to do, is part of the equation, but also sometimes things happen just as a consequence of the design. And I think, like, as a consequence of having a bot that can bite down on another robot and not let them go, or like pin them and that sort of thing, even if it wasn't your intention for that to be how your robot works, it's just a consequence of the way that it's designed. That's I guess that's kind of how I look at it.
Yeah, and I would then sort of add on to that as well, that with the element of control, you have, particularly in machines that lack a high kinetic energy weapon, which is, I think, sort of an implicit thought we all tend to have. We think control bot. That isn't totally accurate to the full statement, since robots like Quantum or Shatter still have the ability to do massive damage even without needing to sort of corral or control somebody else. A lot of it, I think, sort of comes with as well the scoring. We might look at it too. So one example I could give of a very, very good control bot would be like Claw Viper, for example, because Claw Viper can't really do much damage in terms of grabbing you with his arms directly. That has low kinetic energy in its weapon system. Its drive system, however, is excellent, and that is a lot of energy because 250 pounds slamming against a wall hits quite hard. So in its case, the majority of its points then come from control and aggression. That's how we look at the scorecard for it. And the damage consequences are primarily from the opponent inflicting itself. And so, like in Ribot, the fight against Ribot that I'd had, when he was slamming Ribot's or a weapon against the wall in the arena glass a couple times, the intention was if it could break that weapon or shatter something in its drive line, that'd be where the damage comes from. That's its energy level. So then, because of that, its control benefit comes primarily off of going that control aggression side, and its weapon less so, or damage less so. In Quantum's case, it's terrifying. I think you can ask every single person in BattleBots, and they would say, I don't want to fight this thing, because we're all terribly afraid of it going to the top plate and blowing something up immediately, which is terrifying in a similar way that like Shadow is, but also like a different one. You're right though. It is horrifying. I think when it Shredderator, that was a good example of it. It's just sort of the after effect I think people get. Like when it loses its teeth, the control factors in more just because of its shape, like Christine was saying. So I think that's where we sort of implicitly think of control, even if its actual goal and intention is the energy, in this case, precise pressure.
So is it then that control bot is, as is the case with Sawblaze and Quantum, Claw Viper and your machines, that actually you need control to win the fights? And that's probably the biggest differentiator, in that your high kinetic energy weapons can forfeit that control because they put the focus into having such high kinetic energy, which is the most effective way of duffing up your opponent and ruining their evening.
Yeah, I would say that because even though
Yeah.
Sawblaze and Megatron have a spinning weapon, JMO intentionally will not throw it into, a vert disc because he knows he'll completely shatter the weapon and lose because he just took that damage, where instead he's kind of picking his shots when he can, if he can, and not just throwing it to throw it.
Do it against me though, but that's a different story.
And I mean, like the same could be said for Whiplash. I mean, Whiplash does have multiple configurations where sometimes there's a weapon and sometimes there's not. But and that's where I think some of these robots, it's kind of more of a blend. It's not a pure control bot, not 100% pure control bot, but there is a large element of control that is involved in the way that it fights.
This is going to be a long episode.
Hey, that was probably one of the more valid questions. And
It really was.
James,
Yes, thank you,
bringing
James.
it up. I
That was a
really
great
do.
one. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So, I mean, like, going back to the original question, though, and keeping in mind, though, like I said, when we're talking about control, like either pure control bots that rely, heavily on control in some way, whether intentional or unintentional, like those types of robots had more success. Claw Viper had an amazing year and like had really great fights against people that in the past you would have been like, there's no way that they're going to beat this other robot. And it happened. And a lot of that is just iterating on it, and things like that to make it better in the ways that it can be given the type of bot that it is. So, like, do we think that now that we've seen that success, that's something that we're going to continue to see?
I think we're gonna get a situation where there's a lag year or two, and then active weapons will catch back up, because it's always gonna be a game of, well, you're doing something, you're beating me with this. What can I do to take that advantage back off of you? You think about it nowadays, how many verts run these? We took that from control bots, lifters, whatever type of robot it may be. We intentionally had to say, well, we didn't think of this first, but I can't beat you now without this. And so we're going to continue, as long as the non-kinetic energy weapon type robots continue upping their game over and over and over, they will significantly be better engineered and at the end of the day win more fights against kinetic energy weapons, until that catch up is made, and then it starts the whole cycle back over. That's what I think is gonna happen.
Yeah, I completely agree. You have to look at there's three C's that I see in combats robots: cost, complexity, and competitiveness. Cost, I think, like I built lots of spinners for Robot Wars, and I built lots of non-spinners, and there is a cost difference between building a spinner versus a non-spinner. Complexity, there are complexities in spinners. They are not easy, and when you look at them on BattleBots and these high-end competitions, people make them look easy. But when you look at an equally competitive non-spinner, you generally find a high level of complexity. And then there's the competitiveness, and you go for a general level playing field. A high kinetic energy weapon is going to be more competitive than a low kinetic energy weapon, such as an axe, a flipper, or a grabber, or a control bot. So that they're like fundamentals almost. And you look at the robots that were competitive that are non-spinners at BattleBots, and you look at the level that they had to go to. So we take Hydra, for example. You take Claw Viper. The level that those guys had to go to make their robots semi-competitive, not win BattleBots. And Claw Viper is an amazing machine, but it will always stand a high chance of losing because it has to be on its game for the full 3 minutes every single fight to get that giant nut. Whereas we've seen it time and time again where a high kinetic energy, that's the special thing about it, is that it has that knockouts capability that you only have to get them once during that fight, and that can turn the tide, whereas you can't really turn the tide with a Claw Viper. It's a sustained push. So if one day Claw Viper won BattleBots, you would see that level of complexity and that level of dedication put into those vertical spinners, because the special thing about Claw Viper is its drive, and there's nothing stopping any of the kinetic energy weapons putting that same thing into their robots. So there's nothing unique about Claw Viper, unfortunately, that is unique to Claw Viper that cannot be put into a vertical spinner. But there is something in a vertical spinner that you can't put into Claw Viper, and that's high kinetic energy. And you could, but it would make it a spinner.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
kind of bounce off that, there are definitely like some things with control bots that make them innately less competitive in some ways. One of which is you have to pretty much drive a perfect match every time, and one or two mistakes cost you a match. Like Robert Rund has a good saying for NHRL: he only needs 9 points out of 17 to win a match. And that means if you go the full 3 minutes and you drove a perfect fight, you're probably winning. But if Robert makes a mistake halfway through and he gets hit, and either he loses half his drive or loses a fork, he's suddenly in such a pit because he doesn't have the ability, as James put it, to turn a fight with one hit. He then has to essentially do even more than what he was already doing to come back from that, which is one of the aspects that make it so control bot drivers and things of that nature have to either make themselves very durable, where if there is a mistake, like with my bots, I've slowly made it where if I get thrown a couple of times, it kind of bounces off and it looks like nothing happened. But that still shows that I'm losing control because I'm getting flipped, but at least I'm not losing half my drive. Where more active weapon robots, especially lately, seem to be more dependable. Like just slamming, a 3-pound robot into a wall. I think in the past some of them would have broken, but like I know like fighting some robots, just hitting them into the wall doesn't break their weapon, and it's not like I can get damage then. So it makes it much more difficult.
I think what BattleBots is like a year by year basis, right? So you kind of have this slow, like right now, we're like, are control bots going to be, the new meta? It's going to take a while to see. And I think at something like NHRL, with maybe the 30-pound class could be comparable to the heavyweights. I mean, not really, but um, it's almost like an accelerated evolution of the meta, you could say. Um, and right, because because it happens more often. You get results every 2 months instead of once a year. Um, Obviously the robots are a lot smaller, so that's going to play into the meta for those weight classes. Um, but I think like Zach said, it's going to be like the pendulum swinging each year. The robots are going to adapt to the control bots, then the control bots are going to adapt to the active weapon robots, and I think it's just going to keep on going. Um, and then I do think, like right now we are seeing birds with forks have a pretty long trail of destruction, you could say, where they're kind of the meta right now. But I don't think it'll be that way forever. I think probably in the next few years we're going to see um, it change as new technology comes out, new materials, new types of robots, maybe. I mean, just a couple of years ago, I think most people didn't know what an anti-gyro was, right? And now you have Ripperoni who popularized that. Fireball just signed up for a Destructathon, which is a vert with a anti-gyro, right? So I feel like it's going to keep shifting um, as time goes on.
Yeah, Brandon.
No, I agree. It's actually very funny though, because both of the sides have happened to me in the past event, which is just both funny and kind of painful too. So on this side here, Fracas here in the blue and the black. So this actually fought Little Rip, the smaller version of Ripperoni. And I actually drove a pretty good match against them for about 2/3 of the match. But the problem was that as those jaws sort of tried to hold this big spinning mass, they got clipped. And over time, they got more and more twisted. So even though they actually did no damage to the main body of the robot, I still was gradually losing ground to them, even driving a pretty well game. And by the end of the match, they did a very good job of just tweaking the whole robot over, like particularly the jaws, because of that shot. And even though Little Rip doesn't have the same benefits of the big Ripperoni, doesn't have the anti-gyro, nor really a fork game, it still had more than enough ability to, even on glancing hits, do massive damage. And so by the end of the match, even before I got knocked out, I sort of knew implicitly that I would not have a big, it would be a very big pit to try to crawl out of because of that. Because even if I could keep driving this full match, I could probably keep it going if everything went right. I would still never win the damage points back. And as long as they kept getting some decent shots on the base of the body, I could still definitely take it out. And then on the other side, I have Phenomenon here, which you can see its forks directly above. And in those cases where Phenomenon has fought, it has done an excellent job of using the ground game and beating other spinners. Last year, in September Norwalk event, it fought against a machine called Other Disco. Other Disco is also a vertical spinner, but it didn't have the fork evolution that Phenomenon did. And that evolution I built into Phenomenon with the forks made it win against Disco handily both times they fought, without a question. It did an excellent job of getting right underneath its forks, flipping it up, and tossing it out. And both of those times, it was the adaptation taken from a control bot that led a vertical spinner to get the advantage over it. If these two ever fought, I'm pretty confident Phenomenon would win, if for no other reason than because all it would take is a little shot on Fracas's jaws to bend the whole thing, and Phenomenon could just winnow it down slowly and just take it out. Actually, the main thing going into the coming event, the August event coming up, is I'm trying to reinforce the jaws on Fracas. Its drivetrain is the same as Phenomenon. Its construction is very much the same, similar shape. It's primarily a Sawblaze Claw Viper basis there. But the Sawblaze part works great because Jameson understood that if you can have a control bot that can minimize its damage and give you the maximum ability to emphasize your control, your aggression on the other robot, you're doing good. But in the same way that Claw Viper's head got clipped against Mad Tatter, and it lost that ability to inflict its controlness on the other robot, it would just get eaten away. That's what happened to Fracas, like I said earlier. So then, like Zach was saying, if a control bot does figure it out, in this case, the drivetrain, you're automatically going to see a lot of deficit coming in, but it's going to immediately be equaled out. Like, I mean, James, you know as well, Hypershock's drivetrain is ridiculously fast as well. He just had a little bit of unlucky time in other places. But when it actually fought Claw Viper, it tore it up because its drivetrain is just as good, but it had forks and it had a vertical spinner and did its thing.
I think it's when you look at the sports, but it's less so with the smaller weight classes because the investment isn't quite. There's a huge investment in time and money in all weight classes of robots. But when you get to BattleBots and people are putting tens of thousands of dollars on the line, you have people that want to win, and there's a very clear direction if you want to do that. And then you're reliant on people like Adam Wrigley to build a hammer robot. You're reliant on the Wyaches to bring something innovative and different. You're reliant on the guys from Claw Viper to do that. There isn't like a whole stream of other people in the wings waiting to do that. If they decide one day, you know what, we've put too much time and effort into this, or we got families now. You know, if those guys disappear, there aren't other people to replace them. And that's fairly telling in the commitment that's required to do combat robots. And if you want to be successful at it, there is a clear direction to do that. And you can say Quantum did well, but I always analyze our fights and go, why did we do well in that? What is it about that fight that we controlled that's ensured that we did well? And is it something that we can rely on in future? And I look at all of our fights and go, we were so close to losing that. Other than Shredderator, Black Dragon was a really close one. We were surprised we won that on the judges' decision. The Emulsifier one, like one clip, and it could have gone really bad. So we could have quite easily been 1-3. So we come out of it and people say, yeah, you did really well, you know, Quantum's on the up. But we always look at it and go, yeah, but only from the skin of our teeth. Like, we were so close to losing all of those fights, bar one. And maybe the Gruff one was fairly one-sided. I think we managed to get the drive fairly early on. But you always feel like you're on the edge of losing most fights. And it's only at the very end where you look back at it and go, actually, we dominated that. But yeah, well, yeah, you had to win it. Like, anything less than a total domination, and that was a loss. And the consequence of losing are so drastic that we can't afford to give anybody an inch. You have to be on them the whole time. And that brings me back to the point again. It requires so much to be able to do that in time and money, and that there just aren't people doing it because it's not a good way. It's not a good way of winning. Like John Reed, when he finally gives up on Beta, like all the money that he spent, when Adam Wrigley finally goes, you know what, I've had fun, I'm going to go off. Nobody else is building a hammer at BattleBots unless it's an email from production saying, we need a hammer robot, who's going to build us one, and you're on the show. It's a lot of money to just throw in the scrap bin at the end of a tournament.
Yeah, it's definitely hard. Now, one thing that Brandon mentioned, and it kind of made me think of a question, because I've heard several people say this. I mean, it's very clear that durability is really important in BattleBots or any level of combat robotics. You know, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. No matter what kind of weapon you have or your opponent has, or whether you don't have a weapon at all, do you think that if you are significantly more durable than that other robot, that it doesn't really matter what type you have versus what type they have, because you have a better chance of outlasting them in the end?
It depends partially upon the matchup and what kind of things you're doing, because as I've kind of said, being durable as a more control bot oriented thing is important because it affords you a little bit of a cushion where, as well as innately with some control bot designs, I have more weight to put into my drive than some vertical spinners who need to put it in. And that also means I have more weight for armor and things like that. But at the end of the day, one hit in a spot is going to doom me anyway. But it does afford you some flexibility and cushion. Like I have many configurations for a robot. I don't know if they're all great, but I have some thought process depending on what I fight. And having more weight to be more durable in a different config that might be better for a certain type of robot could give me a slight edge that gets me a 9 instead of an 8. Or allows me to, slam a robot into the wall and then, because I had a slightly different ground game for that kind of robot, it then breaks them and then I score damage by breaking their weapon. But at the end of the day, it's still a lot of precision and finesse, maybe just a little less so. Instead of having to be like this, where I have to get in this one little spot, I can be more broad and then it's a little more forgiving. And at the end of the day, it also still requires practice. Like if I make a new fork config and I don't try and I get stuck in the floor, it means nothing, even if it's a pound heavier than the other guy's forks.
To tag off of that, it's almost the inverse of that to a lot of active weapon situations. Like I look at most of my stuff that isn't the core frame and electronics of weapon and go, this can be replaced at the end of the match. I just have to do enough to them in the middle of the fight to outweigh anything that could happen to me. It doesn't matter active weapon versus active weapon or active weapon versus control. There is always going to be that stuff I look at like I can leave the weight out of that. I need that more in my weapon, or I need that more in the motor powering it. I don't necessarily care that this part's going to get ripped off because in the grand scheme of things, that part's $15, whereas we've entered the idea of a blade of armor down a lot of lower weight classes. So at that point, if it's ablative, who doesn't really matter. I'm focused on getting to you and finding the spots that aren't necessarily meant to be ablative and finding my way through to finish the match out.
Adding on to that, I found out my robot likes to be ablative sometimes, especially in that fight against Zack. I decided not to use, when I fought Zack, I had grudged him the tournament before in March 2023. And I was just, it was in the 30-pound box. I was just like driving like an RC car, having fun. And then he nailed me upside down and my weapon went. Typical Bert things, basically. So coming up for our match in May, I felt like it almost as if coming from a control bot perspective, that it literally could take one shot from him to launch, bend my anti-vert bar into my, top plate or bottom plate. So I decided to put on my biggest weapon. It's like a pound in a 3-pound weight class. It was risky because geometry would say no. It's kind of a weird shape. It's almost like Valkyrie's single tooth blade, but with like another tiny tooth. But I got really lucky, and I think I did I hit your upright, Zack, and then he hit his own wedge.
You hit the side of the wedge and it pushed the entire wedge across the weapon.
There we go. So really lucky, but because I went with the puncher's chance and took, a very big weapon, I was able to squeak out the win. But it cost me because I was split in half by like 2 minutes into that fight, and had lost one side of my drive. So, I squeaked out the judge's decision just because of the damage I did. But swapping out that bottom plate, even though I was literally split in half for most of the fight, it was almost like, that's fine. I progress in the tournament and put a new bottom plate on. We'll solve that later, But other times that's bitten me. At Horde recently, I used a lighter weapon against gyration. He split me, my bottom plate, so my weapon went down, and there's a pit at Horde, so I couldn't just like fork him, and survive. And he pitted me. So in that way, the ablative armor almost the wrong part was ablative, essentially. So I think having, like Zach said, looking at parts and saying, hey, this is probably going to break, but I can replace it and I can still win the fight, will factor in a lot to, designs, especially like he said, at the lower weight classes.
I know at the
Okay.
oh, sorry.
No, go for it, Brendan.
Thank you. I know at the 30-pound class, that begins to get a bit expensive, and certainly BattleBots level, it gets very expensive. I know in a lot of Phenomenon's fights at Norwalk Havoc, a lot of the reason that it's lost is just because the shock that it puts out or someone else put into it tends to knock it out. And in some levels, you can min-max it. Like in the back piece here, you can see in silver, that's only 1/4 inch aluminum, and it's basically only bolted on with 2 main bolts. The idea being that if it gets hit, it should just sort of, either ablate completely or perhaps it'll just dent a little, but everything will still function. But the outer armor and the front of the armor on it is still very beefy, because I still have to expect it's going to get hit by some massive machines. And a lot of the times, whenever I'm trying to work on the Phenomenon, I really had the design to be overkill immediately. Even with Fracas, I have to expect it to take a beating all the time, but Phenomenon indirectly, but at the same time, perhaps most expectedly, sees more kinetic energy into itself. And a lot of that is just a consequence of the sort of weapon it has. One really good example that has happened now a couple times, it's fought against Yahoo, the great drum of Norwalk. And multiple times now, the strength of the robot is, even though the shock goes into the drivetrain, knocks it out, or perhaps he nicks something on the blade and the blade, has some sort of vibration issue, the chassis has remained. And that's important, because with the turnaround times at Havoc, you cannot accept a robot that has too much weakness to available. I know in my designs, I design them, as wide as possible, sort of allow that sort of containment so I can maximize my area for armament. But at the same time, if you cheap out in the durability, I think at any level, it's just not going to end well. And with spinners, you can optimize it slightly. But I think if you're any less durable and you get knocked out or receiving sort of damage, that will still hurt. And like Matt said as well, with control bots, it's even smaller of an area. So I have to really expect everything to get hit. With spinners, the area is a bit larger, but still incredibly important to do so.
Yeah, I think there's 2 elements. One's durability, and that's being able to continue battles. And I think this where spinners have really done well over the years is olden day robots, you'd have a big hit and the spinner would probably die. Whereas now they give hit after hit for 3 minutes, the motors don't burn, they don't seize bearings, and they just keep doing it. So durability is critical, whatever robot you build, because the last thing you want is to put all that time and effort and money into something of any scale, and then it just dies from vibration, from impacts, from things like that. But being able to take hits is something quite different, and that compromises something else in your robot. So if you've got the ability to take a spinner hit from the side, you've compromised somewhere else in your robot. And that has to be a decision for us going to BattleBots, and it's different weight classes are very different. So the smaller the weight class, the more extreme the power to weight ratio is. But BattleBots level, we look at the BattleBots robots and go, we're not even going to try and take a hit from these guys. Like the compromise to the rest of the robot would be so great that it's not worth us bothering with it. So we figured that for the cost and weight of having like slightly better armor, we can get really good drive for that, and we can get a balance in the robot that allows us to maneuver the machine where we want it to go. And so the side and the rear of Quantum's all 3mm titanium, which is like butter, really. Anybody go through that, even the weakest of spinners. But you go, well, we've focused on the drive to ensure that that doesn't get hit. So then the second thing is when we do get hit, because although we've compromised and we've put our gamble on the drive system and a chassis that works for us, when that gamble's not always going to pay off, especially when the stakes are so high. So then it's on about how do we make the robot fail in a way that's profitable to us? So if we get hit on the back of the robot, if we get hit on the side, we know it's going to be catastrophic, but how do we make it so it doesn't write the robot off? So the robot's designed in a way that if it's hit from the sides, the armor mounts are weak, so it'll allow it to really crumple in. So the side armor on Quantum can probably crumple in 4 inches before it hits anything meaningful, which a spinner's not really ever going to do. So we know that it's pretty rare for us to get a one-hit KO on our side. Same on the rear of the robot. I mean, the batteries are there and the hydraulic cylinder's there, but it is kind of designed to fail in a way that works for us. So the drive motors are at the back of the machine. So to take out a drive pod on Quantum, you have to hit the back corners. If you hit in the side, it'll go through the drive chains and that, but we'll only lose a front wheel. Well, we lose those all the time anyway, so it doesn't matter. We just learn to drive without drive to that one. So yeah, it's as much about going, first and foremost, we have to be able to take hits, and that's really important if you're a spinner, making your robots so it's durable. But then taking hits, what's the consequence of taking that hit? Will it twist something else? Will it, do we actually care if the weapon goes into our robot? Can we design our robot so maybe it has thinner armor and it's slightly offset, so it doesn't matter if they go through because they're not going to hit anything anyway? So I think when you talk about durability, that it's quite a complicated problem, and it does bring in compromise into the machine design. Durability is really important to make sure your robot can get to the end of a battle. But taking hits, that's up to each team to understand the philosophy and the concept of the robot and how it fights.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of taking hits, I have 2 more questions. This first one is, if you can think of any match where you had, a really big weapon versus, more of a control bot that either doesn't, have an active weapon, like think of all the matches, and you can include one of your own. What was your favorite match and why? And I'll kind of kick off by saying a match that, it's really in my top 10 favorites of all time is Duck versus Cobalt. And I bring it up a lot. It was just one of those ones where, when it started, I was like, I know Duck's durable, but I don't really know how they're going to survive this. And then by the end, Duck is completely mutilated, but they win the match. It's just one of the best things that I've ever seen in history of robot fighting. So I'm curious to hear from everybody else, what is a memorable match that you can think of in that regard? Yes, Johnny.
I would say Quantum and Emulsifier, just because that entire fight, I was cringing because so many times
You weren't the only one.
that jaw was so close so many times. Just this beautiful machined head. It's so close.
It looks so bad after that fight. I have to say that was the one that I was going to say, is that's probably the biggest. We've fought a hell of a lot of verts in BattleBots and over in King of Bots and stuff, and that was the biggest vert that we've ever fought, and we were like, oh man, we could see that they put us in with them because they thought that they were rookies. But you look at the pedigree of the team behind it, and you look at the size of that weapon, and then people said, "Oh, have you seen what the 30-pounder version does?" And like, I don't want to see it. So you go into the fight thinking like it was an odd one because you're already through, so you're thinking strategically, how do we preserve the robot? Because there's nothing really to gain. So how do you preserve the robot? But then all that goes out the window as soon as the bell goes, and you're just trying to win the fight. And for us, Quantum's head is the strong bit. That's a giant lump that is designed for running into those spinners. But yeah, you could see the chunks coming out of it, and you're like, oh, there's only so many more of them that it can take. Even to the point where we managed to get hold of them, and I think their frame got twisted, and then they managed to get it up spinning again, and we'd let go to run the head into it just to try and not let it get up to full speed because we knew that one of those hits would be pretty bad. And they came back to life at the end of the battle, which was like I think it's 27 seconds they were actually dead for, but they came back to life and they hit us, and it's really weird the way it kinks the robot over, but that actually snapped our hydraulic pump. So we lost all hydraulics at that point. So if that had knocked the robot over, we would have been done and dusted. And funnily, we didn't have any spares of that because Quantum takes too much time and effort to build. So back in 2019, we actually gave one to Greg and Trey as a gift to say thank you for having us, and we framed it for them all nicely. So we had to say to Trey, "Oh, can you call your wife and tell her to ship that art piece off your wall?" So she packaged it in the box and sent it to BattleBots, so then we could put it back in the robot and use it for the robot fight.
Fantastic.
So cool.
It wasn't fantastic.
What's it called? A fight I could point to that I remember being very neck and neck was actually from the finals of NHRL last year. I was actually just there hanging out because I was driving a mini bot for someone in the 12-pound class, but I was just kind of hanging out with the pit desk, and we were watching Hot Leaf Juice, which is Lucy Dew's 12-pound undercutter, 4-wheel drive undercutter, fighting Brendan Steele, aka Businessman Cat's Ram Plan. And that fight was very exciting to watch because Hot Leaf Juice's weapon never faltered once, and their drive never died. But the way Businessman Cat, I think that's his preferred title anyway. The myth is he was just driving around, just ramming full speed with his wedge into them, just trying to break the weapon. And he was controlling the fight while doing that, but you could see what he was going for, which was, let me hit it as hard as I can because my wedge can take it, but I don't know if their weapon can. And in the end, it went to a judge's decision, and I think they even posted the scores. It was like a 9-8, 8-9, 9-8, and you could see why he almost didn't win because they'd actually damaged his arm that he uses to like flip himself as well as others. And you could tell it was damaged at one point because he tried to use it and it just didn't really do anything. And you could see why he almost lost, but you could see why he won. And it was very impressive to see and definitely cool. And unfortunately, he had some bad luck fighting Huge at that point afterwards, but it was definitely a fight. If I were driving at that point, I would have been proud of even if I lost.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm still trying to figure mine out.
Okay, cool. So there's one image that comes to mind. I forget perhaps the moments that led up to it and the other bits of the fight, but I still remember the visceral image of Gigabyte being on the shelf, full power, and Tantrum going to the side of it and thinking, okay, and just the thunderous clap of when Gigabyte cleaved into Tantrum's armor and the two robots just exploded apart. And there have been a lot of testaments to Tantrum's durability, especially before that point and many times after. But I just thought about the numbers in my head for a second. I thought Gigabyte has probably the highest energy of any machine here, just by the virtue of its size and speed at its tip. And the fact that Tantrum took that, but was still mostly functional. I mean, obviously a bit of damage on there too, but still mostly functional, was a testament to how bricky something could be. And I really respected him for it. I know, like driving my little machines earlier, like 7th Fracas earlier against Little Rip, there is a beautiful tension that comes with driving a control bot against a very dangerous spinner. Because on one level, there is a great fear, I think, that sort of drives it even more so. Like, I can get eviscerated. At any moment, I could take some severe damage, and if it's in the right place, the right level of force, it could do a lot of damage here. But in the same time, it's exciting because that means that you're that much more in. You're much more focused in it. And the miracle of you not getting destroyed by it becomes all the more powerful. So even getting destroyed in my case, and not really recovering from it, the parts of the match where I was sort of able to have the head just askew of the disc, where I could hold him and pin him there, or even in the case I was able to drive them into Fluffy the house spot and get the recoil shot there. It was really exciting. I would say even more than some of the fights I've had with my verts. Because with my verts, I knew the answer was simply point and shoot. I know it's going to hit something. If it wasn't, I could reset and hit him again. But because I knew that I'd be tactical in ways that engaged me more, made the entire process very exciting. Very scary, though. And by the end of it, when I did get damaged, I was very sad because I couldn't fix it. But at the same time, it was a great joy. It's one that it kind of works in the ant weights and the fairy weights, but they just sort of bounce away, so it's less terrifying. But the 30s and especially the heavies, there's fear there, and the fear is both exciting but also terrifying.
I think for me, I don't necessarily have like that one memorable match. I think for a lot of times, like I tend to, obviously I gravitate to your kinetic spinners. I think as time's gone on though, there has been a massive number of builders who just straight up gained my respect, and they put me in a shock and awe. Like, I couldn't do anything here. A lot of times you have to have that confidence and know that you can go into any match and with a kinetic energy weapon that you can put them out of the fight pretty quick. Matt did this to me really good at the last event. We were just grudge matching. I don't think I could even touch him with the weapon outside of a gentle glance for 3 minutes straight on. And so for me, there's just that respect that comes that I have to look back at the match and be like, I genuinely didn't think that was possible. I have to give them all the props in the world. And so those matches stick with me. Or another match like Clyde, I thought I had the solution to Clyde. And I mean, I went 3 minutes with the robot, which is a testament in itself. But at the end of the day, just the straight up control was just too overwhelming.
Zach's glancing over the point when we grudged. I asked him kindly to not go for the roof me speed because I wanted to try to sneak another 1 or 2 matches in.
I couldn't touch you.
But and you also learn the pain of getting stuck under the floorboards like Robert Run.
I've done that too many times. I run forks.
Well, so my last question, which I mean to me seems like an easy question because I know like for me it's an easy question, but there's been a great debate at a lot of the forums where there are people that are like, we think that all of the spinners should just fight each other and all of the other non-spinners should be in their own separate league. I think that is the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard. And like I think this came up on the panel that I did on unconventional bots. I love to see a match where like you don't know what's going to happen, like because this bot is so much different than this bot, and you just like anything could happen. Like the variety and the diversity, I think that the sport needs that. And if you just have a bunch of spinners going up against each other, I think that gets boring at some point. But I'm just curious to hear what everybody else thinks about that.
I think one element is that there is a right way to win, but the real elephant in the room is the forks. And if you said verts can't use forks, quantum would be all the verts. Like it would become quite an easy thing. And I know that's easy to say, but you could just bring the head back and just run it into the vert. It'd be fairly one-sided. You still have the jeopardy, but the thing with spinners is you get something spectacular from them. You get that one hit that can obliterate them. And as Brandon said, when you're fighting them, it is different. You know that you're putting everything on the line. You know, for me, it's like an extension of myself when we put it into the arena and grind. And if that's why we don't, one of the reasons we don't make multiple quantums, because it would devalue it for us. They wouldn't become part of us. It'd just be like, oh, just grab another quantum out of the boot. So that jeopardy, because they are so crazy in what they are able to do. But the problem the sport has is with the forks is that it's becoming predictable, or has been predictable for a little while, based on who can get under who. If you allowed flippers to get under other robots, they would become the dominant force. It is more complicated to make a flipper. It's more complicated to make a powerful crusher or a control bot. But ultimately, it is that ground game that makes the difference. And you'll have to look at our robot fights. Like, it doesn't matter how good your drive is. It doesn't matter how good that weapon is, how much money you spent on it, how much time you did to perfect everything. All of that goes out the window because your front's not right. And the problem with that is that everybody's getting really good at making fronts, and that's slowing the sport down because now everybody's pretty much as low as each other. So in particular, on a heavyweight scale, it's now comes down to, well, how do I ensure that my front's not very vibrating? And that means that if you're sitting on the spot, you have the advantage. If you've got a robot like Quantum, where we want to drive the machine, we don't want to sit on the spot. It just doesn't interest us, and we go off and do another sport. Yeah, we've got plenty of other stuff that we enjoy doing. So we want to run the machine ragged, and we want to go into a finals and see. You want to watch a final where both robots are being driven the hell out of each other by the best drivers in the world, with the best engineers behind them, best designers, and that's the combination. You don't want it where one is clearly able to sit on the spot and the other one has to do all the legwork, because as good a driver as you are, you're not going to keep that up for 3 minutes, and at some point you're going to get clobbered. That is exacerbated if it's a spinner that can sit on the spot, but it's still, the major problem is the front ends, and yeah, trying to deal with that is a big problem, and I think is going to cause. You'll get to a point where things like Claw Viper just won't get under anybody because they rely on driving really quick and outmaneuvering things. Or if you're not going to get under people if you're driving quick, and there's your fundamental problem. Yeah, it's a tricky one, but you can't have them in separate classes because they're viable. It just takes a bit more.
I will say, looking from the outside in at BattleBots, without having any insight, just watching the show, it definitely, having control bots and more unconventional robots like Quantum and Shatter, create weird, people have to make plans for them, and it creates a different layer of depth where if I'm just fighting two-wheel driver versus two-wheel drive horizontal, or four-wheel driver versus another vert, it creates a different optimization game where it's, battles for tip speed, or I just have to get under them in a certain way that then we contact. Where if you're fighting a more unconventional control bot, it means, oh, I need to invest some weight into top armor, and that can sometimes be a bad thing. Or I need to make belt guards, and they hit my belt guard and it caused it to flay into my weapon and then rip a belt. And
Problem
especially
is that that's allowed though. Do you think that if you took away the ability to adapt your defensive capabilities, so let's say if you're fighting Shatter, it's so easy to just go and get some polycarbonate out the box, or you don't even have to prepare, just go and slap some on the top, and that fully negates their weapon. Being realistic, you can't do that against another weapon type. But if you banned that kind of stuff, all of a sudden Shatter can now start, like, you can start seeing robots that kind of look at the main competition and go, okay, this is a real weak point. Nobody's covering the tops because they can't afford to, because they can't take that weight away from that front end, the forts or whatever. So it leaves them vulnerable to a new type of weapon that can exploit those weaknesses. But hammers are too easy, and crushers, and they're so easy to negate.
Well, I agree with that, but also there were a couple prime examples of things coming to bite them. Like the one I point to, even though it wasn't a control bot, Endgame Vice versus Ripperoni. Everyone's like, oh, Ripperoni's going to get smashed. And then they immediately get stuck in the kill slots. And then Ripperoni gets a free hit. As well as, this happened a couple of times. Like I know Luke Quintel with Copperhead noted in one of his like summaries on one of the podcasts that he deliberately tried to drive over kill slots even because Copperhead doesn't play ground game because he knew that they would struggle, and there's some adaptation. That's one of the things that I think the sport's great at is you see adaptation, and you, as people have said, there are lulls up and down like a pendulum. Where the other thing that I remember seeing like maybe 4 or 5 years ago with I think Ray had posted to Facebook, someone's like, why don't they make the floors perfect like they do at King of Bots? Because I remember hearing stories of King of Bots where they spent like 4 hours hammering floors or something to try to flatten them out to a machine flatness.
They were always perfect at King of Bots.
And I know it worked
They
out
were
great
good.
for you. But Ray kind of said intentionally they kind of don't want to, because adding craters that are, an 1/8 inch depth creates not a terrain, but creates a hazard for playing the knife's edge sometimes, where it can come to bite you, where, you watch Hydra get stuck on the floor because they're going knife's edge. Where some robots are more mobile and they have the ability to, do things that some robots struggle or have to think a little bit about. It adds a layer of thinking. But it definitely is hard when some adaptations just give me a pound of Lexan and the Mary Special probably won't cut my belt. But there's also a chance you put something on your robot that doesn't work at all. And then it still creates a dynamic of, if I didn't engineer it like perfectly, it could still fault you. It's a change that not everyone's prepared for. But I also haven't competed at the 250-pound weight class. The 3-pound class, it's really easy to create some weird adaptations that happen to work out because people can't imagine every 3-pounder that exists in the world versus, oh, I know these 64 robots at BattleBots are going to be here, and there's only one huge.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if you want to have spinners all in their one class, go look at educational. Specifically where I came from, like Southwestern PA Bots IQ, it is one thing and one thing only. It's vert spinners just going at it, and the only thing that ever matters is who's got the best tip speed. It is stale, it is old, it is repetitive, and you just know what's going to happen every time. And you can look at it and go, this team, this team, this team, this team, they're going to fight for the championship. Everybody else can kind of, unfortunately, take a backseat role. Once you add a certain dynamic, it becomes a lot more fun. It wasn't until 2021 that I fought a horizontal that actually could kick my butt. I've been fighting with verts since 2011. The development of a meta matters so much to get entertaining fights. Otherwise, it's just the same thing over and over. And that was the Southwestern PA Bots IQ's thing, was we fought in an 8x8 cage with 12-pounder or 15-pounders. Most 15-pounders are a foot by foot in themselves. A horizontal spinner is never going to have time to spin up. But at the end of the day, if you push everybody to their own selves, like, I don't think this sport's ever going to continue growing. It's going to eventually stagnate, and we're going to all be wondering what happened to it. Whereas nowadays we're putting reg caps at 160 robots for a single day event. Like, it's all opinion at the end of the day.
Like you said, Zach. Also, Christine, did you find that on the BattleBots subreddit? Because that's a very Reddit take. So it's very bad.
It's a very Facebook group take too.
Okay, that's true. Yeah.
It's a certain take that Luke Stangl would call a certain audience member. I'm not gonna say it though.
Anyways, adding on to what you said about horizontal, Zach, we're seeing now at Norwalk as well, the last two events, the 3 pound, 12 pound, 30 pound winners have all been horizontals. Like you said, Zach, 3 pounders especially have been getting so much more durable that a 3 pound horizontal can now take, for the most part, besides mine apparently, can take the hits it dishes out, right? They're not just exploding immediately. And I think that, that's something evolving, because let's say, I bet you, 5 years ago was 2018, people weren't using TPU as often, as prominently as they were today. And that's definitely like an evolution, right? That's like a little step in evolution, where now that has given horizontal spinners an advantage, because it's how more they, slam themselves against the wall and not explode. So I think we are probably, forgot who said it, but we are in a bit of a lull, it seems. We're like, all right, these forks are getting old, these verts are getting old, when's something new gonna happen? And we kind of, right? Like something a little different, but again, there's forks and there is a vert. So I think that's a good point. I forgot who made it, but about, a lull happening right now.
Yeah. Brandon.
Yeah, I'll take it. Let's see. So if I were to put Phenomenon in one class and Fracas in another, that'd be interesting. So one of the benefits of having them mixed together, besides just the danger element of could I die if I choose the wrong or choose a different robot type, which I think is probably the biggest draw in a lot of fights. I think one of the beauties of the Cobalt duck fight was that you looked at duck and you're like, oh no, poor Quacky, it's gonna have a hard time. But then when it's able to do something, it's much more entertaining that way. But a difference is, and like one side of it, Zach already said, you put all the verts in one room, you're going to have about the same effect. You put the horizontals and the verts in the same room, that actually would be pretty wild, but I don't think it would lead to much greater innovation, because you would still have pretty stale ideas. And then vice versa. Let's say I took this lifter and I put it against other lifters. Well, you're either going to end up with the most absurd ground games in the world, which are going to only end up in maybe at best a suplex. Maybe if you can elevate it a bit, you can get a flipper, and you can get, much bigger launches. That's old school Robot Wars right there. The days of Chaos 2. I love that. Back in those days, you can get a lot of big flips there. But at the same time, even they understood, okay, well, you sort of knew in the old school Robot Wars that I have a big flipper and I have a reasonable leading edge that can get underneath some machines. I know what the result's going to be, especially if I can get them towards the wall and get them out of the arena. So by having what you would call entropy built in, or some chaos built into every single match, that's what allows the exciting differences and increases there. So there is a chance that if you put Claw Viper in a Claw Viper versus Overhaul League, let's say, just two purely lifter robots, not even just taking out any sort of level of high energy at all, and leave them in that kind of a league, then you would end up with perhaps some okay fights. You get some good sumo fights. I know Robot Battles in Atlanta does a pretty good job with that, and it's open, it makes sense for it. But if you have some cases where they don't ever fight a spinner, you never get the mythical Claw Viper run of World Championship 7, where he was able to manhandle the previous second seed of the year in Ribot. And that now tells other teams they need to change their verts, because they need to not just have big spinny thing, but it moves okay. You have a big spinny thing that moves very well. I think that's when the fork game comes into it, because now you have a case where the robots are moving very slowly. They're only playing one level of the game. If you have a robot that can only sit in place and dance with little forks, vertical lifter, flipper, it doesn't make a difference. You still have to play the same game. But if you have a machine or an arena or a situation that forces you to now play a different game, now you have the engineers seeing a challenge like, okay, well, let me think about this and let me come back with something new. And then the new thing might just be a really cool thing. And you get some very fun entertainment as well, but also just technology innovates in there too. What if you have somebody who, actually very cool example, say like Beta, for example, has electromagnets suck it down to the ground, because John realized that's a lot more effective than just flying around the air, flopping around. That's a great idea to innovate the robot, and that's directly an impact of getting it to fight against other machines where that matters. If there was a Beta versus Beta class, for example, they both are flying in the air, maybe he'd get to a degree where, oh, maybe I'll sit on the ground a bit more innovative, perhaps, but at the same time, it would not really take a form more effective for many of the situations. I know Jonathan quoted a lot with Huge. One of the benefits of Huge being fed to its non-meta counterparts all the time is that now, when it did fight all of its meta, goals, its prey, it was a much stronger Huge that fought against him, because now it can handle the level of force put into it. He knows how to aggress them properly where they can't do a thing to him. And he was, very close, a whisper away from the BattleBots championship, with only Jameson figuring out a weird idea in Sawblaze's counter coming in to stop him. But you feed him Witch Doctor, you fed him Mad Catter, that was premium for a Huge. And so because of that diversity in the class, you get much more exciting things like everybody said. It's really comes down to sort of how do you keep adjusting that, like the rule set or even just the settings that things are coming in to keep that dynamism up. Because if you have something where everything does remain in 8x8 box, where they just feed verts to one another because there's no other way to do it, then you are going to expect the same result every single time. And perhaps that's useful on an educational level to teach, kids how to design very resilient systems and good engineering structure. But at the same time, taking like a TV show or a larger hobby to sport, the way NHRL is trying to grow it, you have to continue to add that sort of dynamic, innovative aspect to it. And the few, the brave, the bold, give them their props for when they try something that is weird. It's sort of anti-meta. And then they get a chance to sort of show it because, what is it? NHRL has the Firebot with a Dragon Princess when it was around doing a lot of damage. And a lot of verticals and horizontals alike were both scared of it to a degree because it fought Emulsifier and it pinned Emulsifier and set on fire for a good minute and just drenching in flames, that would take it out. So if it became a situation where Matt had to think to himself, okay, I need to innovate Emulsifier to counter Dragon Princess even more so, that shows a progression in Emulsifier's idea. Otherwise, you take it away and you get essentially the same machine for X number of years, doing the same thing over and over again, it becomes predictable. So it's more so than just a simple binary of classes. High energy over there, low energy over there. It's about the goal you're trying to reach in terms of your classes. If you're trying to create a dynamic sport which allows for innovation and sort of forces that by nature, you're going to want everything mixing in together. If you have a case where you want purely educational and you can limit the variables, that way a certain outcome is achieved, then so be it. And if you just want an incredibly technical, safe display that leans into a certain aspect of the sport as a way to sort of counteract other drawbacks you want to avoid, you can adjust it accordingly. So, but it's a lot more fun when you have somebody who's able to both suplex you and a robot that can also throw you into the roof. I can say that from experience.
Yeah. And
I think it's important to note that that there is a difference between things like NHRL and TV shows like Robot Wars, BattleBots, KinkerBots, where you're looking at the difference between a true sport and what's essentially an entertainment program. So with the entertainment programs, with Robot Wars, BattleBots, KinkerBots, there is force diversity where we've got a bite force. We don't want any more applications with a bite force. Come back with a hammer that we know will run for 3 rounds and you're in. So you do get more diversity on BattleBots because it is a TV show and it's a necessity that your robot is different. And that's something that I think it would be nice to address. I think as you said, Brandon, it's critical to have diversity, because then that creates unpredictability, and that ultimately leads to an entertaining thing for people to watch, and that's ultimately what sport or a TV show needs to be. But that could really do with being done via the rule sets or via something else, rather than a forced diversity where you're on the show but you're spinner meat because you've got a subpar thing. And we could, and that ultimately comes down to the rules and the environment. And yes, the arena floor gets beaten up, but it doesn't change the fact that you need to be lower than the opponent. So you're just chasing something. It's just a greater risk for everybody that they're going to get stuck on the floor. It's not changing the meta, because the meta is still the thing that needs to be done. You need to get under your opponent and you need to hit them hard. That's the same solution. It's just now there's just a risk that I'm just going to get clipped on the floor, which just adds random elements into it. That's one of the reasons why we didn't want to lay into robots during our fight, but it's because you got so much respect for all the teams that have put so much time and money and effort into being there. You've got hundreds of people who've been waiting there for an hour to watch this spectacle. You've got these two teams that come in and then somebody just gets stuck on the floor. That wasn't skillful on our part, and it wasn't bad on their part. They had to get lower than us, so they put forks on. It's just we're just adding this random element, just throwing that into the fire to mix it up a bit. So I'd like to see like a bit more positivity on rule evolution. Just go, let's just open this area up, maybe that, and if it doesn't work, change it next year. It's no big deal.
Yeah, very good points. And I mean, honestly, like I do think that's a good question. And it, the whole point can be proven by the fact that, and I know for sure he'll watch this, so I that's why I want to say this. I would be more scared to fight Crash Fest than I would be most of the vertical and horizontal spinners at Norwalk. Just saying right now. So yeah, and Zach is shaking his head.
I have 3
Robert-
losses with the Beetle. One of them is him.
Robert is the funniest guy because he's always just like, why are people scared to fight me? And I'm like, Robert, it's because they don't know what you're gonna do. Because like essentially you fighting Jameson Go Silent Spring Undercutter with forks, everyone's like, you're gonna lose. And then you almost didn't. You almost won it. And it adds a variable that like essentially everyone I ever talk to, because I'm friends with Robert, we're on the same team. They're always like, yeah, he's kind of a wild card. I don't know what to do with that. And that's because he isn't a vert or horizontal. He's actually a control bot, and he's actually won a dumpster in a way that was pretty decisive. And a lot of people don't give him credit for the win that honestly he deserves. Like I've heard people in the community say, you should really just build a real robot. And it's incredibly just disrespectful, honestly, because people who build unique things, like I'm sure Jonathan with, I know Tiny Huge did all right, but Big Huge, he was getting so much flame to the community. He's like, Huge is dumb, like it's just bad. Just make a different robot. And now he's getting the Huge should be illegal. That's like not fair because he broke the meta. And I know it's more of an unconventional point, but like I almost want to say Claw Viper, I think he might be onto something because he drives with such control at the magnets, and because he doesn't have the vert causing instability, there's a point where he kind of makes people freak out and have to think. And fortunately, Will Bales kind of showed that he was fast too and ready, but Will also doesn't play as much of a ground game as some of the other people. And he somewhat makes a compromise because of that, because, he's trying to stay maneuverable to a degree. And those kind of things could, change how the game is played a little bit. If, Kevin gets to you before you can spin up, or gets to your side because you're trying to turn and you're being careful, it does create a thing where you're like, well, maybe I can't run the forks I would run against him traditionally because I have to be more prepared to be maneuverable. But obviously, a season or two, you could see next season maybe Kevin goes 0-4, or maybe he wins it all. You don't know. That's kind of why you got to play the matches. You don't know until you play them.
Exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there were definitely some very, very good points made. And I don't think this will be the last time that this is all discussed. It's very much an ongoing type of thing, especially as, you know, as we see it'll be a little while until next season. But, you know, when that does happen, we'll obviously see how that goes and whether anything's changed in the meantime. But I think, you know, what one last point to throw in there is that when you look at, you know, active weapons, control bots, whatever, you know, you want to define that as, the last two giant nut winners have been bots that are, you know, control bots, even though they both have active weapons, but they do rely heavily on control and durability. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see how that kind of goes in the future. But I thank everyone for joining this discussion. I really really good insight. And, you know, hopefully people enjoy hearing about this stuff. But you know, for everyone that's watching, please make sure that you like, subscribe, you know, give feedback, all of that good stuff. Let me know what other panels you would like to see. I think there's probably an infinite number of topics within combat robotics that I could do. So I'm just, you know, gonna keep doing it because I think these are very, very valuable to get that additional insight. So everybody just keep watching, and we'll see everyone next time on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.